Edinburgh in 1700 was the filthiest city in history. Here's why you'd never survive 72 hours. That is approximately how long your immune system would function before collapsing completely if you were transported to the place I am about to reveal. Not a war zone, not a plague hospital, just an ordinary Tuesday morning in what many considered the intellectual capital of Europe. What you're about to witness through reconstructed imagery is Edinburgh at the turn of the 18th century, a metropolis the locals called Auld Reekie, meaning Old Smoky. But smoke was merely the beginning of this city's assault on the human body. The question that haunted me while researching this documentary was not how people died here. Death was everywhere, obvious, almost mundane. The real mystery was simpler and far more disturbing. How did anyone manage to stay alive at all? Brace yourself. We are going in. Early morning. The High Street. Our journey begins on what appears to be the grandest boulevard in Scotland. A cobblestone artery stretching from the towering Edinburgh Castle down to the Palace of Holyrood House. This is the Royal Mile, and every person of importance in the nation walks here. But look closer at the ground beneath your feet. What appears to be cobblestone is actually a treacherous mixture of crushed rock, compacted earth, and something far worse. Decades of accumulated refuse have been trampled into a thick, uneven paste. Horse manure mingles with vegetable scraps, human waste, and the rotting remains of whatever the city has discarded. Two shallow channels run along each side of the street. Primitive gutters where thick brownish liquid crawls slowly downhill toward the loch below. Within minutes of arrival, your shoes would be ruined. Within hours, any exposed skin would be coated in a film that no amount of washing could easily remove. Yet notice the crowd moving around you. Merchants haggle over prices, lawyers rush toward the courts. University scholars debate philosophy in animated clusters. Nobody retches. Nobody covers their nose. The stench that would buckle a modern visitor has simply become invisible to those who breathe it every single day. Now, raise your eyes upward, and you will understand why this city became a vertical nightmare. Edinburgh sits on a narrow ridge of volcanic rock, surrounded by defensive walls that have protected it from English invasion for generations. But those same walls have become a prison. The city cannot expand outward, so it has grown in the only direction remaining, straight up. Its stone tenements rise 10, 12, sometimes 14 stories into the grey Scottish sky. These are not elegant towers. They are packed human storage units, blocking sunlight from the streets below and creating permanent shadows in the narrow passages between them. Our atmospheric reconstruction reveals something the historical records only hint at. The air itself was slowly poisoning everyone. Thousands of coal fires burning simultaneously, cooking smoke from every household, the gaseous emissions from decomposing waste. All of it became trapped between these towering stone walls with nowhere to escape. The result was a perpetual yellowish haze that residents called the Har. Visitors frequently reported difficulty breathing within their first day. The longtime residents developed persistent coughs that many carried to their graves that came, on average, before their 30th birthday. Consider what this meant for anyone arriving from the countryside or from overseas. Your eyes would water constantly, your throat would burn. Headaches would become your constant companion. And yet the locals would look at you with something like amusement. Another newcomer who had not yet adapted to the particular flavour of Scottish urban air. Adaptation, however, came at a cost. The persistent respiratory infections that plagued Edinburgh's population were not merely uncomfortable. They weakened immune systems, made other diseases more lethal, and contributed to the staggeringly low life expectancy that characterized this era. You have been in Edinburgh for less than an hour. Already, but invisible damage has begun accumulating in your lungs. Your body is fighting a war it does not yet know it is losing, and we have not yet reached the truly dangerous places. Mid-morning, the Nor Loch. A short walk north from the high street brings us to the base of Castle Rock, where a body of water stretches across the valley. Do not let the word loch conjure images of pristine Scottish wilderness. The Nor Loch had become something else entirely, a vast reservoir of concentrated human misery. Every drain, every gutter, every channel of waste from the towering tenements above eventually found its way here. Gravity pulled the filth downward, and the loch collected it all. The water had long ceased to be water in any meaningful sense. Our reconstruction suggests it was closer to a thick, opaque sludge, pitch black in color, broken only by the occasional bubble rising from decomposition occurring beneath the surface. The smell announced itself long before you reached the shore. Travellers approaching Edinburgh from the north reported detecting the loch from miles away, a warning that something deeply wrong awaited them. But here is what makes this location truly horrifying. People used it anyway. The poorest residents of the city had no alternative. Clean water required either money to purchase from vendors or physical strength to carry heavy buckets from distant wells. The loch was free and close. So families came here to wash their clothes, scrubbing fabric in water that contained things no modern laboratory would dare analyze. Some collected this liquid for cooking and drinking. Medical records from the period describe waves of illness that periodically swept through the communities surrounding the Nor Loch. Fevers, digestive catastrophes, mysterious deaths that struck without warning. The connection between contaminated water and disease would not be scientifically established for another 150 years. Until then, people continued drinking poison because they had no other choice. The loch also served another purpose, one that reveals how cruelty and superstition intertwined in this era. Women accused of witchcraft were brought here for trial by water. The procedure was brutally simple. Throw the accused into the loch. If she sank, she was innocent, though likely drowned. If she floated, the water itself had rejected her evil, proving her guilt, and she would be executed by other means. The dark irony is that the extreme toxicity of the water probably killed many victims long before any verdict could be rendered. Infections from even brief exposure would have been devastating to an already malnourished body. The loch had become judge, jury, and executioner all at once. The supposed instrument of divine justice was simply another form of municipal poison. Children played along these shores. Fishermen occasionally attempted to harvest whatever creatures might survive in such conditions. Tanners and dyers used the water for their trades, adding chemical compounds to an already lethal mixture. The Nor Loch was not a lake. It was a slow-motion catastrophe that the city had simply decided to ignore. Edinburgh did not merely tolerate its waste. It built institutions around it, lived beside it, drank from it, and used it to determine who deserved to die. Are you ready to see where people actually slept? Afternoon. The closes. Branching off from the Royal Mile like broken ribs are dozens of narrow passages called closes. These alleyways plunge steeply downhill, some so tight that a person could touch both walls simultaneously while walking. Step inside, and sunlight disappears. The towering buildings on either side create a permanent twilight regardless of the hour. The temperature drops several degrees, and the air becomes thick with the concentrated exhalations of hundreds of families stacked above you. Population density in these closes reached levels that would be considered criminal by modern standards. A single building might house 50, 60, even 100 people, distributed according to a brutal hierarchy written in stone and economics. What the middle floors were most desirable, high enough to escape the worst street-level stench, low enough to avoid the exhausting climb and leaking roofs of the upper stories. Wealthy merchants and minor nobility claimed these positions. Below them lived craftsmen and shopkeepers. The upper floors and basement cellars were reserved for the truly desperate, workers earning barely enough to survive, families crowded 6 or 8 to a single room, the sick and elderly abandoned by whatever systems of support had once protected them. In this sealed environment, disease transmission became essentially guaranteed. Every cough, every sneeze, every breath loaded with tuberculosis or influenza, or any of the dozens of unnamed illnesses circulating through the population, was shared among neighbors, whether they wished it or not. Yet personal hygiene was a concept that existed in theory but rarely in practice. Clean water had to be hauled up narrow, winding stairs from wells that were frequently contaminated anyway. Most residents wore the same woolen garments for months at a time, layers of fabric that became ecosystems for lice and fleas, insects that carried diseases capable of killing within days. Our reconstruction attempted to model the bacterial load present on common surfaces in these closes: door handles, stair railings, shared privies. The results were so extreme they seemed almost impossible, yet they align perfectly with the mortality rates documented in surviving records. A minor injury in this environment was genuinely life-threatening: a splinter from a rotting handrail, a small cut from a rusted nail. Any break in the skin provided entry for infections that would fester, spread, and kill. There were no antibiotics, there was no germ theory. A scratch obtained on Monday could mean death by Friday, and the victim would never understand why. The psychological toll of these conditions is almost impossible to calculate. Privacy did not exist. Silence did not exist. The sounds of your neighbors, their arguments, their illnesses, their intimate moments, their grief, penetrated walls that were never designed for separation. Children grew up hearing death rattles from adjacent rooms. Adults fell asleep to the coughing of strangers who might not survive until morning. And yet, somehow, communities formed. People found ways to help each other, to share what little they had, just to create moments of joy in circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate joy entirely. The human capacity for adaptation and connection persisted even here, in the darkest corners of a city that seemed to have forgotten what kindness meant. This was not exceptional. This was ordinary life for tens of thousands of people, generation after generation. And each night, things got considerably worse. Night. The Gardyloo Ritual. As darkness falls over Edinburgh, the bells of St. Giles Cathedral begin to toll. 10 o'clock. Throughout the city, a ritual is about to begin. One that newcomers learn to fear above almost anything else. In a city without sewers, without indoor plumbing, without any systematic waste disposal, human beings still produce waste constantly. For 24 hours, this waste accumulates in buckets and chamber pots inside every household, on every floor of every building. At 10 o'clock, Edinburgh empties itself. Windows fly open throughout the closes and along the Royal Mile. A warning cry echoes through the darkness. Gardyloo. The word derives from French, gardes l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. But what descends from those windows is not water. But imagine standing in one of those narrow passages when the cry goes up. You have perhaps 3 seconds to react. If you are lucky and quick, you press yourself against a doorway and scream back, "Hold your hand! Hold your hand!" hoping whoever is about to dump their bucket will pause long enough for you to escape. If you are unlucky, slow, or simply in the wrong place, the full contents of a family's daily waste lands directly on your head. In the darkness, with no opportunity to wash, you continue home wearing evidence of Edinburgh's most unavoidable biological reality. Our reconstruction modelled what the Royal Mile would have looked like at 10:05 p.m. on an average evening. The results were almost physically difficult to view. Streams of waste cascading from 100 windows simultaneously, pooling in the gutters, as mixing with whatever already lay in the streets, creating a slurry that would begin decomposing immediately. The ritual had its own dark etiquette. Regular residents learned which doorways offered shelter, which routes to avoid entirely after dark. which buildings housed the most considerate families who actually waited for the warning cry to finish before emptying their vessels. Newcomers learned through painful experience, sometimes literally, walking home covered in filth that marked them as outsiders as clearly as any accent or foreign clothing. Some accounts describe wealthy residents hiring servants to walk ahead of them through the closes after dark, essentially using human shields against the inevitable aerial assault. The servant would take the worst of any unexpected deluge, allowing their employer to reach home relatively unscathed. It was another reminder that in Edinburgh, even the most degrading aspects of urban life could be survived, if you had enough money to make someone else suffer in your place. By morning, teams of street cleaners would attempt to clear the worst of it, but they were fighting a battle they could never win. The waste did not truly disappear. It simply migrated, seeping into the mud, running downhill toward the Nor Loch, becoming part of the permanent fabric of the city. Every morning, Edinburgh began anew on a foundation of everything it had discarded the night before. Midnight. The toll booth and poorhouse. Our final stop lies in the shadow of St. Giles Cathedral, where two buildings served as Edinburgh's solution for those who could no longer contribute to the city's economy. The Tollbooth prison held criminals, certainly, but also debtors, people whose only crime was poverty. Conditions inside were designed for storage, not humanity. Prisoners shared cells so crowded that sleeping required coordination, with bodies packed side by side on stone floors. Illness spread constantly. The mortality rate for inmates often exceeded that of the general population, which is saying something remarkable given what we have already witnessed. Beside the prison stood the poorhouse, Edinburgh's institutional answer to the question of what happens when people cannot work, cannot pay rent, cannot survive on their own. Or the answer, it turned out, was organized abandonment. Inmates of the poorhouse received thin porridge made from whatever grain could be obtained cheaply, often mouldy, sometimes contaminated. They slept in rooms designed for 20, but housing 50. They waited, essentially, to die. Records from this period describe a morning routine that has haunted me since I discovered it. Each dawn, as fog still clung to the streets, carts would arrive at both the toll booth and the poorhouse. Their purpose was simple: collect the bodies that had accumulated overnight. These carts did not distinguish between prisoners and paupers, between those who had committed crimes and those whose only offense was being born without resources. The dead were stacked together and carried to mass graves beyond the city walls, and disposed of with roughly the same ceremony Edinburgh used for its other waste. The living inside these institutions understood their fate clearly. There was no rehabilitation, no path back to productive society for most inmates. The poorhouse was not a temporary refuge, it was a waiting room. The prison was not a place of reform. It was storage for human beings the city had deemed problematic. Both institutions operated on the same fundamental principle: minimize cost, maximize efficiency, and process the inevitable deaths with as little disruption as possible. What strikes me most about these records is the complete absence of outrage. No reformers were demanding better conditions. No journalists were exposing scandals. This treatment of the poor and imprisoned was simply accepted as the natural order of things, as inevitable as the ha, as ordinary as the Gardiloo, as permanent as the stone towers reaching toward a sun that never seemed to shine. In this city, at this time, human beings who ceased to be economically productive were processed with brutal efficiency. They had been useful. Now they were not. Now they were gone. Dawn, a new day. As morning light struggles to penetrate the ha, Edinburgh stirs back to life. Merchants open their stalls. Scholars return to their debates. Children who survived the night prepare for another day of surviving. And here is the mystery that still astonishes me after all this research. These same hellish conditions produced one of history's greatest intellectual flowerings. Within 50 years of the morning we have just witnessed, Edinburgh would become the cradle of the Scottish Enlightenment, while David Hume would develop his revolutionary philosophy in these very closes. Adam Smith would write the foundations of modern economics while breathing this same contaminated air. The ideas that would shape democracy, capitalism, and scientific reasoning across the globe would emerge from this place of filth and premature death. Perhaps there is a connection we do not fully understand. When mortality surrounds you constantly, when death waits in every scratch and every breath, perhaps the mind becomes desperate to create something that outlasts the failing body. Perhaps the urgency of a 30-year lifespan focuses human creativity in ways that comfort and safety never could. Or perhaps the truth is simpler. Human beings are capable of extraordinary things even under impossible circumstances, and we should never underestimate what survival demands. The Edinburgh of 1700 no longer exists. The Nor Loch was drained and became the gardens you can visit today. The closes were cleaned, renovated, transformed into tourist attractions. Modern sewers, clean water, medicine, and building codes have made urban life something almost unrecognizable to those who endured what we have witnessed. But the past does not truly disappear. It lingers in the bones of the old buildings, in the layout of streets designed before anyone understood how disease spreads, in the genetic heritage of people whose ancestors survived plagues and privations that would devastate us today. The next time you drink a glass of clean water, the next time you walk a well-lit street, the next time you take a breath of air that does not burn your lungs, remember the people who never had those luxuries. They lived anyway. They built anyway. They created a legacy that still shapes our world. What does that say about the resilience written into human nature? And what might it say about what we ourselves could endure if we had no other choice? Leave your thoughts below. And if this journey through history moved you, subscribe, because we have many more untold stories waiting to be revealed.